Welcome to this, our fourth episode of PCBCast, and I'm extremely excited to welcome Nick Sawle, our very own private client consultant. Nick has been with the firm for many years now and has taken on an enhanced role more recently, as many of you will have seen. Nick, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, Sam. Thanks very much. I have been a private client solicitor from the minute that I qualified. I started off in a high street firm, heading up their practice in an office. I moved quite quickly into London. I had a fantastic opportunity to work with some very high net worth individuals. It was a fantastic experience over 10 years. Started working in a large London firm in 2008. Our primary clients were high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals. It was a really exciting time. It meant that I could travel, especially to places like Greece and Cyprus. I could go meet the clients. We would get involved and offered essentially a family office practice, which is what I've based everything on since. By family office, what I mean is that a client would come to us with any issue. It didn't have to be related to our area of law. Primarily, the connecting factor would be property. They would have a London property. They would be living in and out of the UK, sometimes up to 5 different jurisdictions. The contact that we had was one of an element of trust, and we were their trusted advisors. I quickly developed relationships with families and the patriarchs, matriarchs, and the children. And you became the first port of call. Anything that happened in the UK, we would be contacted. I've tried to, as I say, develop that throughout my career, and I still have those relationships with my clients that I've been working with for 15 years. It was really good to start with PCB in 2018. It opened doors to new client bases and new experiences, which have been fantastic. I've been working a lot recently with the Far East, developing relationships and client bases there, and it's been very successful. Long may it continue, and really happy.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. That sounds like you've had a really interesting and exciting career, especially with the travel, which I'm sure we'll get into more. So let's start off by, if you just give us some description of the typical problems that your clients face around estate planning, probate, inheritance tax, that kind of thing. Give us a bit of a flavour of what your clients are up against.
As I said, the starting point for most clients, even PCB and my previous employments, has always been the property. When you have a UK property, you have to consider that you are opening up yourself to UK taxes. Of course, Sam and the team will help with the stamp duties and the initial taxes for purchase. However, it depends on what you're doing with that property and what your wishes are going on through the time of ownership, essentially. So if you're purchasing the property with a view to letting, there's tax advice that needs to be had there. If you're looking to purchase properties and flip properties, again, tax advice there. Or if you're looking just to have a UK base, which some of my clients would have, they purchase property in the UK with a view to maybe sending their kids to schools in London. Again, there's certain tax advice there that needs to be at least considered. So we work quite closely with individuals and try to understand what their wishes are. We try to ensure that advisors from different jurisdictions, especially where they're domiciled, that they get involved. So we have a full service, and we're not stepping on any toes and making mistakes in other jurisdictions. Common issues would be, I have a London property, for example, and I want to minimize my tax exposure, especially inheritance tax. So several recent calls and cases have involved just discussions about, I have a UK property, how do I get it to the younger generation without incurring massive amounts of tax? So we have those general discussions. We see what the appetite for the client is and what's best for their circumstances, and each case is decided on its own facts, really, what you want to do, what your wishes are, and that's what we do. That's the main starting point, would be the property. Other cases would be, so again, slightly centered around the property. If you have UK assets or UK property assets, definitely you should consider making a will, just making sure that you cover all bases. If the worst happens, that you pass away and you haven't had time to sort out your lifetime planning, at least you have a document in place to deal with the succession of those assets, and hopefully in the most tax efficient manner. So there's always reasons to get in contact with solicitors, and I'm happy to have a general discussion with clients just on the from the outset, just to see what options there are for them, and then we can delve deeper into what they need.
So it sounds, although on the face of it, tax may seem like a quite specific, narrow focus, in actual fact, it's extremely broad and affects pretty much all areas. And you could almost look at it the way you've described it there, like logistics. If your property being the starting point, obviously with PCB being real estate specialists, that's our natural synergy with you, Nick, and why we've had such a good relationship over the years. And for our clients, who, especially those overseas, it's whether it be to actually spend time here or simply invest here, they're effectively laying down roots, aren't they, of some description by purchasing or investing in the property. And there are so many logistics, life logistics, which come with that, many of them which you just mentioned. And all of them, unfortunately, or fortunately for us lawyers, have a tax angle. So there are things that probably people aren't thinking about, but they should be in terms of the logistics and the financial planning that's involved with investing or purchasing property in the UK. And that's why your role is so crucial.
Exactly. Foreign investors really enjoy buying London property. One, there's been a very strong market for several years. It's cyclical. It does go up and down, but generally they have been good investments over the many years. Unfortunately for the foreign investor, the non-UK investors, the government have been cracking down since 2008, especially on investments in properties. And it's just about navigating through those issues. The fact that you can get a really good investment in the UK and a good return on those investments generally is what entices people in. But as you say, there's more than one issue to consider when just buying a UK. It's not just let's buy a UK property because it's a good investment. I need to consider what's the tax consequences. Again, if you're looking for a capital increase and you want to live in the property because you're going to send your children here, you've also got to consider things like your residence. Are you going to become UK tax resident? What's the issues that surround residence? And these are topics that have been looked at in relatively small detail by the government, and taxes and changes have been introduced over the last 10, 15 years. So it's a really interesting area and something that people should really take careful, considered advice just to make sure that their ducks are in a row and that they have made the right decision all along. So, yeah, it's interesting times.
You mentioned residency there. Let's talk about local residents for a moment. So what's your general exposure and experience been with locals in the UK, and how have you helped them?
I have a very strong practice within the local community as well. Obviously, the Londoners, and I have many clients who are UK based and are UK resident, and essentially it's the estate planning and making sure that they have the right testamentary documents in place, that their wishes are going to be given effect on death, essentially. And there are the offspins, especially in the issue of mental capacity is a big issue that we take obviously seriously. We can provide the lasting power of attorney advice, and we can give advice to people who their loved ones have unfortunately lost capacity, and we can discuss deputyships and things like that. So there's lots of areas which I have acted on and continue to act for UK residents. It's the bread and butter of what I do: the wills, the probate, the lasting powers of attorney, the general private client work. And even with the local clients, that you have the long-term clients who continually revise their wills and come to you and look for advice. And if your circumstances change at any time, it's always advisable just to review your will to make sure that everything is okay. So we have a constant flow of work in that respect.
It comes across very strongly that relationships are a very key part of this, whether it be your Greek shipping clients who you've got a very strong bond with within their community, or whether it's the local families who you've represented and advised for many years. So tell us a bit about the importance of relationships in the kind of work you do, and how you've built that kind of rapport with your clients sometimes over decades, not to age you too much.
Yeah. I, as my boss used to say, you go from the the grandparents down to the births of the grandchildren. You have been with the family that long, generally. The whole reason I actually went into private client to begin with was the exposure to individuals. It's the fact that I'm dealing with an individual and I want to make sure that they are protected and they're looked after. And that helps build that relationship. I think if people understand that you do care, you are trying your hardest to work with them to make sure that everything is okay, I think that does come across, and that's what we build the core relationships on. It's high net worth and the ultra high net worth markets. There's different aspects because obviously they're slightly more guarded about who they discuss their matters with, their advisors. But once you have a good rapport and there's that element of trust, it's a fantastic relationship. Go to really is, if you have an issue and you need to discuss it with anybody, please just give me a call. I'm happy to discuss over the telephone, over tea or coffee, whatever, just to have a general discussion. But there'll be no fee, unless obviously if we're speaking for several hours, there may be an issue. But I'm happy to have a general conversation with people just to build a relationship, to connect with that person. Sometimes it may be that the connection is not always there, but we always will provide a decent service anyway. So it's for me, the relationship is the most important thing, because you want to do the best by your client. You want to make sure that they're cared for, protected, and they get what they need from us and leave a good impression. That good impression, I hope that I leave that with the majority, if not all, my clients. And that's why I've had a successful practice, repeat work. This is the first advertising marketing that really I've done in 15 years, because there's not really been a need. I'm not saying there's a need now. Obviously, a nice way to introduce myself to the PCB client and referrers and networkers.
Just hearing you speak there has made me really realize why we have such a strong synergy and connection with you and you with PCB. Those in our audience who are maybe clients or key stakeholders that we work with that know us well will know that relationships are at the forefront of PCB and what we do, and that individual rapport that can be built, that if someone wants to speak to any one of the team, whether it be a partner or paralegal, we're all available. And that is really the core of what we do. Being within the service industry, that's what it's all about. People should have a right to take the quality of the legal work for granted. I'm not suggesting they should. I'm sure that, there are probably, unfortunately, firms out there who don't do a good job. But we're not being judged on that, because we are the technicians, we are the experts. Only we know that's being done correctly, which of course it is. So clients have to take for granted that we're doing that well. And then what we're assessed on is the service levels and the relationships. And that's what makes going to work enjoyable as well, as when you're dealing with somebody that you get on with well, that you're pleased to get a good result for. And I really liked what you were saying about care and protection. So it really comes across that you do care for your clients and you care for what happens to them. And I think in your line of work especially, that protection is really essential, isn't it? Because people don't know what they don't know in this area, and there's a lot that they don't know, and it can create problems if they're operating without that protection and advice. Would you mind it just to give everyone a kind of high level overview of just the different things that you might cover with someone, whether it's estate planning or dealing with a probate or preparing a will, just to give people an idea of the areas in which they need to be making sure they've got this kind of protection, and this, don't know if it's going too far to call you guardian angel looking out for them, but
when you are looking to buy a property in the UK, it's the starting point for me. I'm looking to buy a property. Okay, so they will come to you guys and say, we put an offer and we've had this accepted. Can you represent me? Fine. So they will then go through the processes. I think at that stage, it's probably just a good idea. Just have a quick chat, maybe. I'm looking to buy a property in the UK. What do I do? Is there anything I need to look out for? And we can just have a general chat to see what their wishes are. Again, if it's for rental purposes, we would need to have a chat to see what we can do in relation to the declaration. If it's for just simply purpose of just using as a UK base, again, just have a very quick chat so we can just make sure that, look, this is what I recommend you do, and these are the people I'd recommend speaking to, etc., etc. So it's a case of For me, just making sure that they are fully aware of what they're getting themselves into before they actually get into it is the most important. And then when we go through the number of times that I've had people who have been recommended by clients and they say, oh, I purchased the property, but I didn't register for this, or I didn't register for tax purposes. I've been earning income for the last 2 years. What do I do? It's not the end of the world, but it's something that needs to be looked into. So that's the thought process is, look, I'm entering into the UK. I'm entering into a different market. What do I need to know? Let's speak to Nick. Let's speak to Sam. We need just to get some advice, because that way what you're doing is you're ensuring that you're going in on a level playing field. You're protecting your asset. You're making sure that if it is for future tax planning, you're protecting it for your future generations. And we're there just to guide you. We're there to help. So whatever comes out of that, it could be any number of issues that may come out. It depends on the circumstances. But I would generally say, seek tax advice, maybe consider making a will. If you have a UK property, you should consider making a UK will. We would liaise with you and your tax advisors in the jurisdiction in which you live, just to make sure that everything's tied up. And then you can hopefully sleep in peace that you've done the right thing. Constant review, I would say every couple of years, maybe, just to make sure that everything's still okay. And that's it, really. It's we've done our job, you've done your job, and we can move on, hopefully.
So tell me about some of the negative consequences if you don't take this kind of action. What can happen if you just leave yourself unprotected?
From a tax perspective, a couple of relatively recent cases that they were unaware of their tax obligations in the UK, and they hadn't sought the advice, didn't know what to do. They came to me a few years after, and what happens is then an investigation by HMRC is generally how it starts. They've received a letter from HMRC to say, we think you should be complying with this, you are not complying with this. And it's just that fear factor that's involved. It's, I haven't done something that I should have. The tax authorities in the UK are now pressing me to give information. What do I do? The worst case scenario is that there's penalties and interest charges on top of the taxes that you have to pay. So ideally, you don't want to be starting off on the wrong foot. With respect to succession planning, wills, etc., lifetime gifts, the worst case scenario would be if you have not thought about your succession planning and you don't maximize your tax allowances and tax savings that you could make by making a will. Certain beneficiaries are chargeable, others are not. You could end up paying up to, from an inheritance tax point of view, up to 40% tax on anything over your thresholds. So it's something that's seriously needs to be considered when you're making a will and planning what you're going to do for your estate. So it's just certain factors. I think that for me, what you've got to be concerned about is, have I considered the taxes in a way that I'm protecting myself as much as possible, that I'm as tax efficient as possible? And again, from a succession point of view, are the beneficiaries who I want to inherit, are they inheriting? If you don't have a will, your estate is essentially succeeded by people who are dictated by law. There's a list of people that will be the beneficiaries, and
including the Crown,
including no one left. Yeah. So it's a case of the will just adds certainty. You can choose your beneficiaries. You can choose your executors. Executors are the people who essentially take your will, collect in the asset, pay the debts, and then distribute the net estate to the beneficiaries. Without having a will, you have no control over who administers your estate. You have no control over who is the beneficiary of your estate. You have no control from a tax perspective. You will be taxed at whatever you're taxed at. You've got no control to try and find tax savings. So it's always worth that conversation with us, just to make sure that you've got all of these things covered.
So there were obvious financial implications which you discussed, and
yeah,
that's the thing that springs immediately to mind when we think about tax and estate planning. But there's also that same word again, relationships, to think about who's going to be inheriting your property.
Yeah.
Who do you want to receive it? Who don't you want to receive it? And I don't necessarily mean your relatives there. I'm more referring to the Crown, although I'm sure there's plenty of people listening who've got relatives that they wouldn't want to benefit from their estate necessarily. So there is that side of things. And you used another very important word, which is control, and keeping your possessions and what you've spent a lot of hard work and time
Yeah.
throughout your lifetime building, keeping control of where that ends up and who ultimately benefits. So there's not just a financial implication, but there's a very human element to it as well, it sounds
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, it's not that common, but there was a young lad when I was relatively newly qualified. He passed away unexpectedly in a traffic accident, and he wasn't married. He had parents, and the estate was split between the two parents. From the mother's perspective, had a very good relationship with his mother, but I didn't have a relationship at all with his father. But the father was entitled to 50% of the estate, so it wasn't a nice situation. But that's that.
Yeah, I think that you've hit on two very important points there. The first is that this applies just to this applies to everybody, not just to people who might be getting towards the end of their life and thinking about these things more. It can hit any one of us at any time, and although none of us like to think about that, what's most important is that our loved ones that we leave behind are cared for, and you can end up in some really difficult situations, younger people, for example, because they haven't thought about this and it just doesn't cross our minds. It shouldn't,
Yeah,
but unfortunately, it's something we should at least have a plan for. There's an example of my father used to volunteer for victim support, and obviously I can't go into detail, but there was an example of where a young man died very young, and he left a fiance, so they weren't married,
yeah,
and all of his wealth went to his father, who turned very nasty on the fiance. And I don't know if I'm embellishing it or not. I think she may have had a baby or been pregnant, and basically, no, perhaps not, but basically she didn't get access to anything. The father prevented her from having that, and you can bet your life that that wasn't the wishes of the deceased, and he would be absolutely distraught if he knew what had happened. So don't want to paint too bleak a picture
oh,
and too many horror stories, but there are some serious things that once you realize that these things do happen, we sleep a lot better at night knowing that, as you said earlier, our ducks are in a row, and that's really what this is about.
yeah. It's always important if you have any kind of assets. You don't necessarily need to have millions. You want it to go to the people that you want it to go to, and you need to make sure that you have those things in place that just give you that peace of mind. Some people find it relatively difficult to make that jump and make a will, especially with the Mediterranean community. I am of Mediterranean descent. The thought of making a will is almost bad luck, superstition that if you make a will, it's going to cause you problems and you're going to pass away. It's not. You can't have that mentality, because it does happen. We are all going to die, unfortunately. So you may as well get things sorted before you go. There's something that, as I touched on before, is the lifetime planning. We can decide during our lifetime, look, I have assets that I no longer need, and I want to pass this down to the next generation. Various rules we need to consider, but not to bore you with now. But there are various rules. We can make lifetime gifts, but by the time that we reach the age where we've got to consider our wills and etc., the estates have been reduced, and legally there's no tax consequences if we do it properly. So by reducing the estate during your lifetime can save tax on death. So there's still things that we can do. There's, as we all know, the majority of people's wealth are residential properties, the ones especially in which they live. The values when people purchased and the values now are completely so far at the other end of the spectrum that people's estates do fall within the tax brackets now. So it's something to consider. You've had this asset for a long time. What can I do with it? Can I get it down to the next generation without paying tax? Have a chat and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, exactly. And you touched on cultural differences there. I think there are many different views on this kind of thing. And I think one thing we all have in common is that we don't like to contemplate it.
Yeah,
And you mentioned Mediterranean towards this kind of thing. And it's very similar in Asia, where we obviously have a huge client base. And they don't like to contemplate death. They don't like to, again, it seemed like bad luck. They don't like to worry about what's going to happen to their assets after they've passed on. But it's unavoidable, as you say. And interestingly, they do in Asia seem to be almost obsessed about tax. So perhaps that's one
Yeah,
way to gauge their interest
yeah,
on this topic. And it is one of those things that it can take a lot of getting your head around. I know in Asia, for example, inheritance tax is a bit baffling, and we're used to the concept here because we grew up with them. It's been normalized for us, but when you do think about it, it is a strange thing to be taxed when you die. The flip side of that is we don't take it with us. Should anybody really keep anything, is the other end of the spectrum. So definitely a very interesting topic. What are your views on that? And just give us your own personal opinion on inheritance tax. And
I think I probably speak for lots of people. Obviously, it's a tax which doesn't leave a nice taste in your mouth, really. Inheritance tax, for me, it's something that we have to deal with. However, it's not something that you feel is a nice tax. There's such thing as a nice tax. You've worked all your life, you pay tax on your income, you pay tax on the products that you buy, you pay tax on your property, you pay tax on any property that you sell and make a gain on certain properties. And then at the end of it all, you're taxed at 40%. It's not an insignificant amount. Yes, there are some thresholds. These thresholds haven't increased for many years now. So by that token, although inheritance tax has remained at 40%, the fact that property values have increased and the thresholds, the tax-free thresholds, have not increased means that more people are paying tax. More of us falling into this tax bracket. So it's not something that, as a tax solicitor, I'm not overly happy when I advise people, I'm really sorry, but there is a tax burden of X amount. It's not something that I want to, the advice I want to give people, but it is part and parcel, and unfortunately, of modern private client work.
and I suppose that's why the relationship is so important, that you've built that relationship of trust, that you can deliver that sometimes hard to hear news and that kind of thing. And they know that when you're telling them that, it's because you have to, not because you want to. I think that can make a big difference in the type of work that you do and how people respond to it. It's never going to be fun. It's never going to be something that they're enthusiastic to hear, but it makes a huge difference how it's delivered and who it's delivered by, I think. And
Yeah, I think what does of help is that when you can say, look, there's this that we can rely on to reduce the amount of tax. So any small wins it does help, because I think in the UK we are pretty much resigned to the fact that there is likely to be tax on death, but there could be some rules, there could be some areas where we can take advantage of some savings, or even during your lifetime, there's certain things that you can do during your lifetime, making gifts out of your income, that I've had some significant wins essentially with gifts out of income, which is a standard tax planning rule. So it's not ideal, but if we can at least minimize as much as we can from our point that the tax burden, I'd hope that the clients could then go on, pay the tax and draw a line under it, and then move on. I've dealt with many different clients. You have client that are high net worth individuals who made the money during my lifetime. I'm now going to spend as much of it as I want. I'm not worried about the tax planning. I'm not worried about giving it to the next generation. They have to make their own way, and it's each to their own. It's whatever the client's wishes, and that's what's fantastic about it, is every client is different and their circumstances are different, their wishes are different.
I think you've just described my dad there. He's come up twice in this podcast.
I would leave it there. I don't want any sore points. But,
not the high net worth bit, just the spending it all.
Yeah, but there is.
Dad, I hope you're listening.
But there's good measure for that as well. They have worked all their lives to build up the money that they've earned, and if their kids are doing okay for themselves and not in any financial need, of course, go and spend it, give it to charity, do what you need to do. That's another issue, is giving money to charity. There's reasons to give money to charity, so many reasons, but there are some tax advantages as well.
I think that's right. You can end up in this very ugly situation where children are almost waiting for their parents to die to get a lump sum, and that's really very ugly. Generally, people are happy to pay tax, but it has to be the kind of right amount. And I think if they've paid more than they needed to, that's where it starts to feel painful. So most people have a fairly philanthropic or community spirit where they care about other people, and paying tax is part of that, but it has to be in balance. That obviously applies to all taxes, not just inheritance tax. And obviously where you come in is to help get that balance right and to make sure people aren't overpaying. Earlier in the conversation, Nick, you mentioned an issue that you'd come in to rescue. Um, why don't you tell us a couple of your career highlights, maybe one from home, one from abroad, that really stuck out and were memorable for you?
It's quite difficult. It's 15 or so years, if not more now. There's really lovely cases that you come away with and you've done a good job. The clients are really happy and you have that connection thereafter. One that I was quite pleased with the results. It meant that I had saved the estate quite a considerable amount of money, approximately about £250,000. So this was a lovely old lady. I met with her. I'd made a will. That I got on very well with her son, and unfortunately she passed away. As I said, she was quite elderly, and the son came to me and said, "Look, Nick, can you help me with the probate?" So I said, "Of course I can." So we went through her estate and relatively a large amount, but what was considerable was her actual income. Her income from pensions and her husband's pensions and various sources was very high, and with that, she used to make regular gifts to her grandchildren. Her actual expenditure was so low that the son told me that it would basically be when she's going out, she'll go to get her hair done every month or every couple of weeks. She'll go out for tea or coffee with her friends, and that would be the extent to her expenditure. So her expenses were low, her income was really high. So we managed to, the client was unaware, but we could make these regular gifts out of income, include them in the estate, and those gifts are then reduced from the estate for tax purposes, even if they're made within the last 7 years. So as a result, we managed to get about £250,000 out of the estate for tax purposes, which the client was extremely happy about. So that made me happy.
How does the son feel about being bypassed on the gift straight to the grandchild?
I think the son was okay because he wasn't exactly short of a bob or two. I think it was estate planning to a certain extent that maybe she didn't realise, but I think it's when your children have a significant amount of money or not significant amount, if they're secure enough and the grandchildren need some support for university, some support for purchasing property, then not just the house, the bank of mum and dad, it's the bank of the grandparents as well sometimes. So all round, I think that the family were quite happy with that result.
If it's who I think you're referring to, I think you've told me about this before, and possibly quite a high profile client who maybe you don't want to share any details about, but
yeah, no, exactly. It's not something that I would like to divulge, but yeah, it's but they were happy.
Great.
Going back to the question, a Greek perspective, as I say, I generally deal with lots of Greek clients, but any Mediterranean, Middle East, and now Far East, I have lots of clients. For me, there's no particular win. The feeling that I get, though, from assisting these clients, providing for these clients, and being there for my clients for the last 15 years, I'm very privileged to be in this position whereby I act for high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals, are significant people in their own rights, and they treat me as a trusted advisor, and that's what gets me up in the morning. That's what I go to work for. It keeps me driven, it keeps me ambitious, and being there and helping them for whatever need. They come to me for anything that's connected to the UK, and that's what is most pleasing for me. So I wouldn't say that there's any one particular win for that, but
well, I've been fortunate enough to be your guest at the Greek ball a couple of times, the Anisian ball, and it's very obvious how much of their community you are. And that's how they are anyway. I felt part of the community, and I've only met them 2 or 3 times, but you're certainly very much a part of the family. It felt, and I can see why you find that so rewarding, and yeah, that makes sense. I think probably some of the listeners might have been hoping for some details on what they might do or what they should do when making a will or planning tax. And we've obviously covered inheritance tax and some other tax planning considerations, but it seems like it's such a subjective topic that nobody can really give a one size fits all advice like this on a recording like this. What should people do who do want to take steps to protect themselves. And if you can give maybe 3 steps or some next steps for what people should do that can apply to anybody, what would you say to them?
First of all, I would say that it's a good idea to review your assets, see what you have, what the approximate values, what kind of assets are they? If you haven't got a UK asset, I'm considering to get a UK asset, what do I do? Just to have a general overview of what you have. Tied in slightly with, look, I have these assets and what's your end goal? I think the next step is, what is my end goal? I have these assets. What do I do with these assets? I want to pass it down to the younger generation. I want to hold on to this asset for the capital increases, for the rental income. What is your end goal? What do you want to happen with this particular asset or these assets? Should I be reducing my estate for tax purposes? Could I be getting this into the next generation? Those kinds of considerations. And it is, as you say, it's subjective. It's specific to that person. I couldn't really give general advice because it really depends on what you own and what your wishes are. Finally, the third step would be to, you've considered your assets, what you have, you considered what your end goal is. Speak to somebody, speak to your advisor, speak to me. These are my concerns, these are my wishes. Do I need to do anything? In an ideal world, you won't need to do anything. Everything's in place, and you don't need to undertake any tax planning. You don't need to undertake legal fees. You're good to go. However, without that conversation, you won't know. So at least have that conversation, see what the options are, and then you're safe in the knowledge. At least you can make an informed decision. I have to do something, I don't have to do something. So they're the 3 steps really that I would suggest.
Okay, so step 1, review your assets. Step 2, think about your goals. And step 3, arrange an initial conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
Good.
Great. Anyone who would like to arrange that initial conversation with Nick or even myself to make that introduction, you can contact me or Nick directly. Details will be in the link accompanying the podcast, and please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thanks very much.